So this presentation, then I'm going to provide you with some takeaway strategies underpinned by theory, supported by my own personal experience as a lecturer. Evidence to challenge modern student engagement to generation alpha students. So the couple of outcomes or objectives I thought we needed to throw into the mix. So we're gonna explore the modern notion of student engagement and consider how we get students or the student to buy into what we want them to do. Now, by that, what I'm talking about is trying to get them to complete work, try and get them to undertake tasks, and try and get them to go through a process of learning. Because what we're finding is now that student engagement is a huge thing. It's a huge thing, and it started to take over delivery of higher education. We refer to student engagement for a multitude of different things now, and it's because we refer to it from a multitude of different things, it's started to lose the concept of what it actually means. So as Carrie mentions there in a study that they did in 2013, student engagement has been used for that many different things that it's starting to lose all meaning, and it is now starting to become a proxy for quality. It's starting to become a measurement for quality. All right, well, people are trying to measure it. And then what we've seen, I don't know if you can think back to, we had a learning and teaching conference a couple of years ago, and there was a guy came to the learning conference called Alex Buckley, and Alex Buckley was from Strathclyde University, and he covered his work around the UK engagement survey, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And that was developed as a mechanism to try to measure student engagement. And also we had the previous year to that, we had Christina Hughes from Sheffield Hallam University that was involved in a lot of work for HE around learning gain. And again, this was something that they were trying to bring in as a measure of student engagement to try and categorize and benchmark what people are doing. But what is student engagement? Let's try and narrow that down, because there's a multitude of different things that it falls under. But it's sort of a way that we can refer to that is around the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism, and passion that the students show when they are learning or when they are being taught. And it can lead to motivation. It can be linked into the levels of motivation, and it can also be linked to progress in their education around what they're doing. We can also look at student engagement in other ways. So we can focus and narrow down student engagement to 3 different areas. So we can look at student engagement through behavioural engagement, cognitive engagement, and emotional engagement. So behavioural engagement links to the students' behaviours within the learning environment. It's linked into the participation in education, so how much they apply themselves. And this includes sort of academic, social, and extracurricular activities of the university. But what this can also be linked into is pressures. And we'll touch back onto pressures in a minute, but we're talking more from a pressure perspective. I'm talking more of external pressures that students are placed on. So that can have an impact on their behavioural engagement. So then we've got emotional engagement. So the emotional reactions in the classroom, that sense of belonging and that sense of connectedness in the school. So that's going to be really difficult at the moment with the situation and scenarios that we're in from a COVID situation at university, because working from home and learning from home and being in that home environment and being away from that educational surrounding can have a real impact on the emotional connections of students in the learning environment. And then finally, we've got the cognitive engagement. So the students' investment in their learning. And then we can link this back to ideas around motivation and self-regulation, and how much the students want to learn. How much are they going to commit to that learning process? So that's taken from Fredericks, Blumenfeld and Paris, from a book called Teaching in Higher Education, and I've got some references at the end of the slides, so we can I can share the slides with you at the end. But that's their 3 dimensions of education, and this is one of the first things that I started to look at from a point of view of student engagement, when I wanted to explore what it was around student engagement that really made students tick. So my background, I was a former lecturer in further education, and so student engagement's looked at totally differently in further education because of the nature of the students that come through the door between the ages of 16 to 19. Students on vocational programs have different challenges and different sort of commitments. So you've got students that come through the door that are massively disengaged within a learning setting. So they come from really probably problematic backgrounds, negative previous educational experiences. So one of the added challenges that you've got with students of further education is you've got to get them to reintegrate with education. So when you start talking about things like emotional engagement, you've got these barriers attached to an educational experience. You've got that sense of value that you've got to get back into the students and get them to understand the benefits of being in that learning environment. So there's almost a case of you've got to get the students to buy into that process. And one of the things I learned very quickly as a new lecturer in further education when I used to teach at Leicester College was that engagement was critical in classroom management. If I didn't put various things in strategies and techniques into place, students would disrupt, students would become aggressive towards each other, students would become problematic to each other, and you would have disciplinary situations in a classroom, all because the students failed to be kept busy, really. So there was an element of work ethic that you had to get into those students, and we'll come back onto that in a moment because I'm going to talk more about that baseline understanding of engagement. So the Higher Education Academy or Advanced HE as it's called now, did a piece of work, did a study around developing various key attributes around the student experience in education, in higher education. And what they wanted to do was look at transforming various different elements. So they looked at transforming the student experience, transforming assessment, transforming student engagement, transforming assessment feedback. There was loads of different things within this framework, and you can access this framework online, and there's a link in the reference list. And what they looked at doing is they looked at compiling a piece of research that looked at all the different components that went into engagement, but looking at it from a human state perspective. So they looked at all the different concepts around intellectual engagement, emotional engagement, behavioral engagement, as we've previously discussed, the physical engagement, social engagement, and cultural engagement. So from a point of view of cultural engagement, we can look at how the students interact with resources and how they connect with resources and within a learning experience. But does this link into their backgrounds? Does this link into is there something that they can relate to within the learning context? All right. And what I'm talking about there is there anything within the curriculum or within the taught content that the students can connect with and recognize themselves in? So when I did my teacher training many years ago, because I didn't do too well at school and ended up going sort of back into education through the back door, following things like construction apprenticeships meant that I wasn't really exposed to A levels and high levels of education. So when I went back into my teacher training, I had to sort of learn a lot of jargon, a lot of key words, and learn the understanding of them because people didn't explain them and explore them any further. But one of the things I always recognised is that my sort of route way into education and my upbringing wasn't really recognised within that curriculum. And the reason for that was that the educator on the programme didn't take the time to establish the backgrounds of the students within the room. They didn't take time to get to know the students. They didn't get time to understand their sort of goals, their dynamics, what sort of route ways that they came through. And also within the particular content, it was always very one-dimensional. So the images that we used were predominantly images of white people, on the middle class, in educational settings, the sort of stock images that you'd find online. So there was no sort of recognition of the diverse demographic within that learning environment that the lecturer interacted with. All right. So one of the ways that students interact and engage with curriculum content is that they look for themselves within that content. If that's not there, very often they switch off. From a social perspective, we can link that into the sort of the relationships that they formulate within that learning environment. So we can build this into things like rapport building. So as lecturers, do we take time to connect with the students on a social level? So when they walk into the room, or whether they're first people that come in online, are we talking to them just about how their sort of day-to-day operations have been going, how they're progressing on the program, etc. We've got things like behavioural, which is linked into the reasons for them accessing the program. What's their sort of overall goals? What's their purpose? What's their focus? The emotional content links into their passion for the subject. How genuinely interested are they within that subject? And we'll come on to this idea of deep surface and strategic learners in a moment. But how much are they sort of committed to that subject outside of the learning environment? Because if it's a hobby and it's an interest outside of the learning environment, it will become a lot easier for them to learn and take forward within the session. And then also the intellectual engagement. So how are the sessions pitched, and the level of content that's in there, the level of sort of reading, the pre-work, the in-sessional content that's in there, all links and is all a big contributor from a human state engagement perspective. One of the really interesting pieces of work around levels of student engagement was by a guy called Bob Shaletti in the US. And Bob Shaletti worked at the University of North Carolina. And he did some work around 2009, 2010 on the levels of student engagement. And he published his paper in 2011. And it's interesting. It's from a book on student engagement, and the book's referenced in the slides at the end. And what he suggests is that students go through 5 stages of student engagement, and learning only ever really takes place. So learning that makes a difference and learning that is transformational only takes place when students are in the green zone and they are demonstrating high attention and high commitment to their learning. And then, and only then, we say students are engaged. All right. And by engaged, what he's meaning there is he's talking about committed to the learning, embracing learning, and also absorbing learning. So there's a cognitive process of absorption within that learning content that students are able to learn, but also they're able to hold on to that learning, and they're able to recall, recite, and apply that learning as well. So he talks about 5 stages. So from a point of view of these 5 stages, we'll just go through these now. So first of all, rebellion. So students that are demonstrating the rebellious stage, these are students that are going to refuse to do work. All right, if you pose a task to these students, the students refuse to do the work. These students often disrupt. So not only do they disrupt themselves, they'll disrupt others, they'll disrupt the session. There's going to be a negative attitude towards any sort of formal education, any sort of previous education as well. And one of the sort of calling cards of a student that's demonstrating rebellion is that they'll look to substitute tasks. So when a task is asked of them to complete, what they'll do is they'll manifest a task for themselves to do. Oh, I'll do this instead. And what that student is demonstrating there is they're demonstrating at levels of rebellion. Now, we can also link rebellion into there may be wider issues there. All right, if you've got students that are demonstrating this sort of refusal to work, the disruptiveness, there could be some hidden elements within that, some hidden barriers, some things that's preventing the student from sort of accessing the task. All right, so if we have a student that's going through that rebellion stage, we don't just want to discard them, but actually what it does do is that for me, if I was in a learning environment, that would then trigger off a warning sign that would tell me that I need to do some further investigation with that student. So I might want to take some time to do some one-to-ones with them. I might want to take some time to explore previous educational experience. I might want to look at if there's any barriers that is coming through, any sort of previous educational evidence that we can call upon. So next on the scale, we've got retreatism. So retreatism, no attention, no commitment. So retreatism, so the signs we're looking for there is that the students are switched off from the task. There's no attempt to comply with the demands. There's no attempt to undertake the task that's been asked of them. And they learn very little. But the difference between retreatism and rebellion is that there is no disruption. All right, students that are demonstrating retreatism will just literally, they'll just be happy just to sit there in a lecture setting and may do nothing. And one of the signs you can look for within this, especially from an online perspective, is that there's very low, there's zero interaction within the online learning environment. There's literally just the name and a silhouette. The microphone's off, the camera's off. You try and contact them or you try and get in touch with them, there's no response. All right, they'll just literally hide. Then we move on to ritual compliance, and this is where we start to see some degree of learning take place. All right, so the students expand the minimum effort, but what they'll do is they'll expand that minimum effort to avoid consequences. All right, they recognize that actually there is ramifications of me not doing something, but I'm going to do the bare minimum. So from a point of view, if you're looking at these students in a learning environment, it looks like they're sort of ticking along nicely, but their outputs are very little. And what we can do is class these students as surface learners. All right, they're just skimming the surface. They're just doing enough just to get by. Okay, under the radar. There's no warning signs being triggered by students that are going through that ritual compliance. There's some degree of learning. Students that are demonstrating ritual compliance will ascertain very quickly the minimum level of output. All right, so this is what we would class as surface learning. So anybody that's been on the PG CAT program, we've looked at surface level students, we've looked at deep level students, we've looked at strategic students. So ritual compliance would be those students that are surface level learners, all right, just sort of doing enough just to get by. Then we've got students that are going through strategic compliance. So these are students that are demonstrating high attention, but low commitment, all right. So they're going to be they're going to engage in the tasks, but the tasks are going to have little value. All right, they'll recognize very quickly that there's value to the learner, what they're doing. All right, what they'll also do is recognize very quickly where the task links to the outcome. All right, they'll look at in value and they'll make sure that they'll only retain what is of value from an educational perspective. All right. And this is what we class as strategic learners. So where we're talking about assessments, strategic compliance students become interested, all right, because there is inner value attached to what they're learning. And that's really important for strategic compliance students because it's the value that acts as the motivator that then they go and take that forward, all right? So we are getting some degree of engagement with these students, but it is engagement through purpose, all right? I need to engage with this because it's in the assessment. Finally, we've got engagement. Okay, we've got students that are demonstrating high attention, high commitment. All right. These students recognize the value in learning. They recognize the value in the experience that they're undertaking. And these students will persist in the face of adversity. They will rise to challenges, they will overcome challenges, and they will learn from absolutely everything that they encounter. All right. Now, these students are what we would class as our deep level students. Okay. So ritual compliance students are surface level learners, strategic compliance are strategic level students, level learners. Engagement are our deep motivated students. Now, anybody that teaches students and is face to face, when you've got a group of deep level students that are deeply motivated in what they do, they literally teach themselves. All you've got to do is just literally light the paper, away they go. All right, and ideally, if you had a group of them, your day job would be super easy because it would just teach themselves. Let's have a look. We've got a comment here from Di. So let's have a look. We've got Di's put, wow, this is so interesting. I've just had a eureka moment. Wow. Strange theory. Would make a good paper. I'll be in touch. Oh no, Di, you're going to give me some work. Is that work that's coming my way? Question to the audience then, if we've got time, do the others in the audience have this resonate with their disciplined teaching? Okay, yeah, does anybody, so just in the chat, if you want to just link in there, just anything that's going through, is this starting to resonate with your practice? Are you starting to see this with your students now? Okay, Karen's put definitely, that's great to know. All right, and then we've got a couple of comments coming through, a few people are typing. All right, so this is really interesting. So this is work by Bob Shaletti, and this is something from an engagement perspective that we never really focus on. We use student engagement as a sort of a throwaway term all the time, but we don't actually understand what it means. We've got to be prepared to investigate engagement within our practice. All right, we've got to understand what engagement actually means, and that's really important. So from an engagement perspective, can it be measured? And this is very difficult because it all depends on what you class as student engagement. Okay. So, just a quick comment there from Matt's put on there. Yeah, recognise these behaviours, especially apparent in online seminars. Lots of silhouettes. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to come on to online in a minute, but we see that a lot, don't we? If it didn't matter how many students that you have in an online setting, you get a lot of those silhouettes. Very little students actually have those cameras on and interact, but we see a lot of sort of silhouettes in there. So you've got a lot of students going through that ritual compliance phase. All right, they're just skimming the surface. I need to look busy. I need to look like I'm interested. But so I'll just log in. All right. So can it be measured? So we know that work by Christina Hughes on learning gain tried to sort of get into the idea of measuring. All right. Now, the idea of learning gain was to look at student starting points, look at students' end points, and measure the distance between the two. All right. Now, that wasn't engagement. That was learning gain. That was what it was called as learning gain. But the space in between the start point and the end point is actually that element of engagement. And it was really difficult to quantify and measure how much a student has grown from a humanistic perspective, from a professional perspective. What sort of hidden elements have they taken on board that they've learned socially? How have they changed from that? It was only really the measurements of the assessment that were able to tell us their grades, and all we could do was find out from a grade perspective how much they've gained. Now, one of the difficult things was that you'd have people coming in on low tariff scores that may leave with a first. They're going to have a greater learning gain than someone that's come in with 2 A's at A level and leaving with a 2-1. So it was really difficult to give that a really meaningful score, a meaningful measure. And that's pretty much why the learning gain study has disappeared, really, because it was too difficult for people to measure. And it's the same really from a student engagement perspective, because we don't fully understand what we mean by student engagement, and it's now become this umbrella term for so many different things. It's really difficult for us to measure. because engagement isn't the same as learning. Engagement's so many different things. It's motivation, it's interaction, it's rapport, yeah, it's connections, yeah, it's attention, it's outputs as well. It's really difficult for us to measure that. But then we've got, obviously, we just mentioned briefly around Alex Buckley and colleagues at Strathclyde undertaking the UK engagement survey that they published a newer paper in 2017. And what they tried to do was come up with a survey. And they do this a lot in Australian education. They've got an engagement survey there, which sort of mirrors their version of NSS. And what they were trying to do is look at like sort of benchline and benchmarks for institutional performance against student engagement. But again, define student engagement. What do we mean by student engagement? And this was one of the challenges that Alex got in the teaching conference when he came and he did his presentation later on. And he even said himself that for the engagement survey to have purpose and to have value, you have to, as an institution, decide on what you mean as student engagement. So if you ever have anybody come and investigate your practice and ever have anybody look at your teaching and look at what you do, if anybody ever says to you about engagement and say, how do you engage students? You're quite within your rights to go back to them and say, well, what do you mean by student engagement? Give me an idea of what you mean around student engagement, because student engagement now has been blown out of all proportion to become this umbrella term that means so many different things. King has got a comment just there around what she tries to do from a point of view of students. And she's talked around developing a study ethos and trying to encourage students to have a study ethos as well, which I think is really nice. Yeah, it is a constant battle though, King. You're absolutely right, because the constant battle comes from having so many different personalities. If we go back to Shaletti's work, we've got students in a group setting that are all over that scale. So it's going to be really difficult to sort of, okay, if we've got a student that's in the rebellion phase, to get them to the engagement phase, it's a hell of a lot of work. And there has to be a real degree of self-realization for that student to go through for them to achieve that. But one of the ways we can do that is by recognizing the links between motivation and engagement. And if we go back to something really primitive like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we follow something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and use that as a foundation for developing an engaging and motivational learning environment, then we can have a lot of success with this, and we can see growth start to take place. Now, obviously, it's really difficult if you're delivering lectures to like 300 students. I was talking to a colleague in HLS yesterday, and he was telling me about he can deliver to anything between 25 and 300 students in his lectures. So it's really difficult for him to think about engagement on that individual level. So he's got to go for a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and we'll come back to that in about the next couple of minutes. But if we look at the pyramid on the screen, you've got things like, you've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs breaks things into two different categories, so psychological needs and self-fulfillment needs. But it works the same as engagement, really, that if you look at those basic human needs, it all links to the angle of developing a foundation for learning to develop and learning to flourish. So if students come in, or if you've got students online, they're hungry, they're tired, they're thirsty, they're going to be distracted. So we've got to address those physiological needs. So we can, and obviously online, we can say to students to have a snack next to you, get a drink, etc. And then things like security needs. Now this links into, if we're going to ask students to commit to answering questions, if they don't feel safe and secure answering questions, who wants to volunteer? If the students don't feel safe in that environment, they're not going to give you an answer. All right, we have to develop that security network and that security blanket. As long as students understand that they feel that they're safe and then they're in a safe environment, then you can start to build on that. All right, and then also that sense of belonging. and love needs. So building those relationships, building those friendships at university is crucial. Students online may have not even seen or spoke to their student colleagues yet because they've not even been on campus yet. All right, we've got to think about that. So far, their whole student journey has been about seeing a silhouette of someone's name on screen. So those friendships haven't been developed yet. I genuinely feel for anybody that was a first year student this year. They've not had a chance to do freshers, and they've not had a chance to do loads of different things that normal first year students would. No, sorry, not normal. Your average first year student would go through. So then once we've addressed those basic needs, we can start to then look at building esteem needs. So we give them, so how we build esteem needs is about recognizing achievement, recognizing commitment, effort, and it's about where we can motivate students. And when students then get to that area of self-actualization, that's when they can recognize, actually, I can see my own skills and ability here. I have the tools to be able to do that. If we look at Bandura's theory around self-efficacy, we can see that there is links from self-efficacy to motivation, because self-efficacy links to your own understanding of what you're capable of. All right, and that changes with confidence. All right, so motivation develops confidence. So there's a good piece of research, and it's available on ResearchGate by Ashgar in 2014, around the links between self-efficacy and student engagement. It's something I'm really interested in at the minute, around developing self-efficacy with students. But it's about, as lecturers, if we take time to develop that student confidence through recognition of effort and energies, we'll get greater commitment from those students as we're going along. Di's just come in for a question for the chat. If anyone wants to fire in, it's, do you buy into the idea of this as a pyramid, as a hierarchy, or do you see it more, Di, do you see it more as a level line, or do you see it's just something more progressive? All right, so on the online pressures then. So the idea of this existential threat to higher education in captivating students within the online domain. So we've got this sort of challenge, and this concern is, whereas we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we are seeing obviously numbers starting to diminish. We're starting to see more vaccines being administered. So it's all pointing in the right direction. So hopefully one day we can be back on campus. But what we've been through in the last year will absolutely change higher education moving forward. So, I mean, particularly from our perspective in Pod, we deliver staff development programs. So it's made us radically look at what we need to deliver physically. Can we deliver a majority of it online? I'm a big fan of delivering face-to-face. I think face-to-face learning and teaching will always have a place, because you can't replicate in an online setting the interaction and connections that you build in a physical learning environment. So for me, you will always have that need for that physical environment. But we need to think about, okay, well, what are these online pressures that we're going to be coming into? So we need to recognize the fact that actually we need to consider the use of pre-sessional tasks, discussion boards, and encouraging sharing among students to try and get them to interact as much as possible with the different silhouettes on the screen. But one of the good things about learning online is that we can really break the content down into those bite-sized chunks. And we need to look at that model of breaking content down into the bite-sized chunks. I mean, even if you're going for a really super long lecture, if you're delivering a 2-hour lecture, think about how you deliver that 2-hour lecture, all right? If you're going to consistently deliver one long, continuous process, you're going to start to switch people off. People are going to start to want to take breaks. People are going to start to want to disengage, because they've got a platform to disengage there. People are going to start getting tired. They're going to start getting restless, sitting in the same position. So if you're not careful, and we'll come on to this at the minute, but we're going to start talking about the idea around sort of summit, base camp and death zone. If you're not careful, persistently long lectures take learning from the summit to that death zone where people start getting bored. So we need to sort of realign that. So the challenges around of distance learning and working online are multidimensional, really, because we've got challenges where students are becoming overcomfortable. Maybe they're staying in bed too long. Maybe their body clock has now just become a total mess because they're in lockdown all the time. We've got issues of access. So not all students have access to laptops. Some students are accessing sessional content via mobile devices only, which poses a bigger problem from an interaction perspective. I was talking to a policing colleague yesterday, and he was telling me that he knows of 10 students that haven't got laptops on his course, and they're accessing the online stuff through their mobile device. We've got things like anxiety and stress anxiety associated with isolation, not seeing people for such a long period of time, and the general process of being in lockdown again. That sinking feeling when it comes on the news, on the press conference, that yet again we're in lockdown, is playing havoc with people's mental health. So we've got a lot of things that are starting to get manifested that we're going to have to start to deal with as a sort of a byproduct of what we've been through. The middle point there around people being overworked is not just isolated towards higher education, but it also links to education in general. And if anybody's doing working from home and also doing homeschooling, some schools are just literally bombarding people with things for students to do because they think they're going for quantity over quality, which is wrong. They should be looking at it in the other way. And they're posting work sample after work sample online to keep students active and to try and keep them ticking along, because they're worried about, teachers are starting to genuinely get worried now. And I was reading an Ofsted paper in the week around the amount of work that school children are missing and the impact that that's going to have later on. So really crucially then, so how do we engage students? All right, what we need to think about is, all right, so as a starting point, so how well do I know my students? All right. Now, I don't mean getting to know the students on an individual basis, one by one by one. That's no good. If you've got 300 students, you're never going to get to know them one by one. But what you can do is you can start to go outwards to students and you can start to survey students using Microsoft Forms and try and capture information attached to more of the broader dynamic. All right. So get an indication of how do they prefer to learn? Do they prefer to learn? Do they like to use images? Do they like to use chat boxes? Do they like to use interactive programs? We'll come on to them in a minute. So what you need to do is you need to go out to the students more. All right. Don't be afraid to complete a form, a Microsoft form, and I'll send you a sample. When I send you the sessional resources after this, I'll send you a sample and you can start to build a form. You can send it out to students and use that to try and steer how you deliver. Now, it works either with smaller groups and it works with bigger groups. All right. It just means you just got to start to just marginally adjust what you do. So we know then that engagement is an umbrella term, but it's an umbrella term for a multitude of different components. So things like interest, motivation, inclusion, rapport, interaction, contribution, participation, involvement, attention, focus. There's loads of different things. All right. No one is ever going to say to you, right, how do you hit all of them in your teaching delivery? Because that's just ridiculous. All right. But what we want people to do is sort of focus on, well, what, by doing your student survey, what are you able to tease out as being the key sort of attributes? Now, for me, the most important ones are motivation, inclusion, interaction, participation. I think they're the most important ones. If you can start to understand from a motivational perspective, that if you can find out what makes your students tick, all right, then you're going to start to make inroads into getting them to engage from a deeper notion. So that's something very simple. I mean, just talking things like using videos, using images, using interaction, using more of a social learning theory as opposed to a more of a closed off piece of sessional delivery. It just means that you can go out and gather more information from students. Even if you do, you can gather some feedback after students, that can help. But what you need to remember is it's a team effort. It's not something for you to burden alone. All right. It's something for you to do as a team. So if we start to bring in the Everest analogy now, if we're going to climb Everest, I'm not going to do it by myself. If I do it by myself, I'm asking for trouble. All right. it's too much like hard work. I need a support network with me. I need people to bounce ideas off. I need people to motivate me as I'm going along. But what I also need to access is my wider support network. So things like, we have obviously CELT at DMU, we've got class, we've got student academic services, all right. But also in that wider support network, you've got people like myself in my position as academic professional development consultant that are there to help you develop and design these strategies to support and to access engagement for your students. So there's one of us for each faculty. And if you email me at the end of this, I'll be able to tell you who your academic professional development consultant is. And we're all about helping people develop their practice, all right? But one of the people, one of the members of the team that's overlooked is the actual student themselves, is around talking to the students. I mean, I'm a big supporter of talking to the students, of gathering as much feedback from them as possible to help shape my delivery. All right, I'm not delivering a session for me, I'm delivering it for the students. If they want it delivered in a different format, I need to know that. Okay, so think about that wider support network. Yeah. All right, so let's just talk about then how we're going to get to the summit, how we're going to work our way up this pyramid. Now, apologies to Di, the fact that I've got a pyramid on there. Karen, Library and Learning Services, I think they do have a named person, but you can come to me if you want. I'm happy to support Library and Learning Services. All right, so what we need to think about is we want to get to that deep level of engagement, all right? We're not going to climb it by ourselves. We're going to need a support network of feedback, student profiles. We're going to want to engage with the wider DMU support network. We're also going to want to bring peers and colleagues along with us. All right. If we bring in peers and colleagues along with us, anybody that teaches on the modules and the programs that you're working with, you're going to get a greater overall impact with this. Okay. So with any sort of engagement journey to take your students forward, you need to have a baseline starting point. All right. This is the most important part of the engagement journey, because what you are doing here, you are priming your students. Now, with baseline working practices, this is where you be absolutely transparent with the students, and you need to do some pre-sessional work. So this is where you get out with those surveys, but also you talk to your students, you email the students. All right. You drive the learning environment, but essentially, if they want any changes to that learning environment, they've got to talk to you and they've got to let you know. All right. You want to foster an environment that supports engagement and inclusion. So people want to feel included within that learning setting. If you've got a group of international students or English as an additional language students that are in there, and they don't engage or contribute to questions, the chances are is that they don't feel like they belong in that session, or they don't feel confident enough. What you need to do is think about, how am I going to make them more confident, yeah, to get in. Secondly, once you've achieved that as a baseline working level, then you can start to bring in those elements of low-level engagement tasks. All right. Now, these are the sorts of things where we're talking about anonymized participation via online platforms. So things like the chat box is good because the chat box is there, it's on the screen, we can bring that in. But also I can bring things in like Mentimeter, which is online, it's via the device, and they can post things anonymously, the same as like things like Padlet as well, because it's anonymized. And this is where you want to be using things, so online, anonymized online platforms, to talk about the fact that it's a secure space. All right. But you want to be grabbing the students' attention as well. And this is where you've got to talk about first impressions, because we've got our baseline, we've got our foundation, and then we're coming in with our practice. All right. We've got to be prepared to do things like break down jargon, break down terms. Okay. And then if we can, we want to start using access language. And by access language, what I'm talking about is not talking in acronyms and talking in jargonistic terminology, but talking about, I'm going to introduce this acronym first and then I can use it. I'm going to introduce this piece of jargon or this industrial terminology, and then I'm going to utilize it. All right. And then people can start to progress, because once you're doing that, you're going to start to build confidence as we're going along. And then when we get to the medium stage of engagement, we can talk about, this is our base camp. All right. We can afford to stay here for a bit if we like. When we get here, we can rest, we can recuperate, all right, we can get our heads down for the night if we like. Okay, but this is what to get to this stage, we've got to be prepared to reward contributions. All right, we've got to be prepared that any volunteered answers that's given, we reward them. All right, so great point here coming from Kinga, lovely point here coming from Di. Matt's given us a great point here. Okay, we've got a comment, really interesting question here coming from John. It's those sorts of words and it's that sort of dialogue that you use that generates responses and it generates interest. People will pick up on that. So think about how you use language as an engagement tool, because people will be listening to everything that you do. So once we've hit that base camp, then often in my experience, what I found is once I've set those foundations in place, I've got students where I want to be there. I can start to work with these students a little bit more, but I want to push them up. And so I'm going to take students on the way to full engagement, and I'm going to start to get them to do tasks. I'm going to get them to do given tasks. I'm going to provide them feedback where possible, but I want students to be able to lead the feedback. So I want students to give me some feedback, but to do that, I've got to build that confidence level. All right. So I'm calling this the deaf zone because one of the sort of the key stumbling blocks that we see that we see lecturers do on the PG CAT when we're observing sessions is we see lecturers plucking out questions from thin air. They're thinking of a question in their head and they've got an answer in their head, and then they pose it to the students. The question's not based on anything that's been taught or anything that's been delivered. So what we do is, when they pose that question, all of a sudden students don't know the answer to that, or they start to get confused. We're going to set the engagement back a level. So what we've got to think about employing there is things like pre-planned questions. Sharing those pre-planned questions with the students can help that angle of student engagement. Okay. Then once we've done that, then we can move to the summit and we can start to think about students being fully engaged, deeply motivated with a subject. What you start to find is when you get to this stage is that students are autonomously offering responses to tasks without prompting. Okay, if you're in a live session or if you're in a physical session, you're going to start to see body language become quite open, become quite animated, become quite confident. Dialogue's going to be confident. Students are going to become free to interact with each other. All right, and students are going to start to pose you questions because they will know more about that content. So when we think about engaging students, we've got to be thinking about, okay, I've got to take my students on a journey. They're not just going to walk in through the door as engaged students. They're going to need you as the lecturer or as the leader of that session to progress up the scale. Again, if we think about that Everest analogy, if we're going to, success doesn't come in straight lines. Okay, Clive Woodward said that in an article after he won 2003 Rugby World Cup. He talked about the fact that success doesn't come in straight lines, and when he does his business dialogue and his business talk, he talks about the same things. So we can be prepared to go backwards a step. We can be prepared to sort of take our time. We can be prepared to go sort of in diagonal lines. But if you're thinking about things like sessional pre-tasks, you've got to be prepared to play the long game with pre-tasks. So if I want students to undertake a pre-task for my session, I don't just want to lump them with a 15-minute presentation to watch, a screencast to watch, or a whopper of a journal to read. I need them to focus. I've got to get them to buy into the process. I want them to do 2 minutes work. Then when they come into the session, I'm really using that piece of work. There's purpose, there's genuine purpose to everything that the students are doing. Once I know that they've done that task at 2 minutes, then I can increase it a little bit. I can start to do 4 or 5 minutes. I can increase it to 8 minutes, to 10 minutes, and then to 15 minutes. I'm doing it progressively, all right? I'm working my way up to that level, all right? Especially first-year undergrad students, we don't want to be adding to their stresses and their pressures. We want to be able to get them to buy into the process. Then, after we've done that, we always want to link into the idea around purpose, but we don't necessarily want to penalise students for not doing the work, okay? Which is a bit of a bummer because people will put the effort in. So what we need to make sure we do is that we always use the pre-task. Don't ever give students a task to do that you're not prepared to link into the session yourself, all right? So from a student engagement online perspective, to make sure that we're getting up to that summit of Everest, be prepared to connect with students and make contact with students, okay, inside and outside of the session. Be aware of those external commitments and those external challenges that students have got, and take a realistic view of those outputs. What am I asking students to do outside of the time? All right. Remember, it's quality over quantity. Don't take the school's approach that they're doing at the minute with students online and go for quantity. All right. We want quality. We're in higher education, so it's about depth of understanding as opposed to volume. Always make your resources available for students, and be sure to establish what resources are at hand. All right, so what resources are needed by the students if there's any additional resources that students have access to. Try and have your camera on at all times, because by having your camera on in a live session, it brings that sense of realism to the session, and there is an actual face behind that camera. And you need to go back to basics from a planning perspective. Okay, so we've got structure and we've got purpose to the sessions. I'm running a little bit over, so if people do have to go, please feel free. The session is being recorded, so I'm going to stop in a bit, because I think the next one starts in 5 minutes. All right, and feel free to use the model that's on the screen. So think about in a session or through my module, how am I taking students on a journey? How am I starting off? What's my baseline levels of engagement? Okay, what's my minimum expectation from an engagement perspective? Right, from a medium level, where am I happy for students to get to, so we can start to rest before we progress and we build on further. All right. Just remember that students take a lot of motivation from being in control in sessions. So giving students sort of responsibility tasks can help push them up further. If you use a lot of questions in sessions, think about how you stack your questions. So from a stacked perspective, it's about accessing questions all the time. We've got a selection of pancakes on the screen. We're not going to just plow into them and eat them all in one go. We're going to slice them up and we're going to eat them in small chunks. All right. So if you ever pose a question to students and that you don't get any answers, what you want to think about is, right, how's my question structured? So think about operating an open platform for students and get them to address a pre-planned question, and that always works well when it's focused on a recap. From there, you can start to do small group questions. So 4 people in a breakout group works really well. Any more than 4 students, you get passengers to start to talk about different things. They become disengaged. Then you can start to do paired questions. So you pose a question to 2 students, and they work in a pair, and then they feed back. Then and only then can you start to get students to respond to individual questions. You pose a question, get some individual responses, and then at the top of that questioning pyramid, the students can ask you questions. And this is what I've used this loads of times in my practice to get people to engage. And what it works on is it works on a series of building confidence as we're going through. You've got things like environmental extras on there. So from a point of view of learning online, it's all about what additional extras can we bring in. So we've got things like, you've got things like Scrumbler that's on the left-hand side with all the post-it notes. We've got my daughters at school, they're using a combination of Google Classroom and Loom. Things are pitched and presented online. So Loom's just like Blackboard Collaborate, really, and Panopto. And then we've got things like Kahoot and Padlet down at the bottom there. But these things just bring an extra dimension into your talk content. And that's it. So we ran over by 6 minutes. So just as a takeaway then, think about, from an engagement perspective, you've got to think about how do you engage your students. Students are not going to walk through the door engaged and focused. They're going to walk through the door at one of Shiletti's levels. All right. And we've got to be prepared to work with the students, start to gather some information about the students, and start to build on what they do. Think about your journey to the summit. How are you going to get to that deep level? All right. Plan it out. I'm happy to comment any more if anybody's got any questions. I'm happy to, if anyone wants to drop me some emails about student engagement, I'm happy to work with people on a one-to-one basis. I'll send these resources to anybody that's attended. You'll also get the recording when it's finished. I think the recording is going to be sent out next week. Thanks very much for attending, and thanks for engaging. Enjoy the rest of the conference.